Welcome back to the High Tech Freedom Sales Podcast. This is episode number 122. So I have a question for you. Have you ever worked for a company that has gone through change? Of course you have. All companies do. Have you ever worked with or for a company that did not manage well through that change? Many of us have, and it's frustrating and painful. Well, my guest today, Marsha Acker, has built a profession around helping leaders improve how they communicate and manage through these changes. As sales leaders, as sales professionals, there are some great nuggets in this episode. For example, Martha dives into her insights on creating space for open dialogue during change, the role of individual contributors during change, and how leadership can challenge their own views to discover new and better ideas. Because at the end of the day, we're always innovating. Enjoy the show. Welcome to the High Tech Freedom Podcast. This is a podcast where we bring successful tech sales professionals, thought leaders, and entrepreneurs to share best practices, insights, and lessons learned with other tech sales professionals. As a sales professional, the more we learn, the more we earn. Once we earn it, how can we put those hard-earned commission dollars back to work to build additional income streams that will create the freedom we are all working to achieve? I'm your host, Chris Freeman. I'm a high-tech sales leader, real estate investor, and lifetime learner. Well, Marsha, welcome to the High Tech Freedom Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Chris, and thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So why don't we jump right into it? So why don't you tell the audience just a little bit about your background? What do you do?
Well, today I am a coach with executives and leadership teams. But I often say I come with a tech and software engineering background. So my start and my degrees were actually in software engineering. I had a super big passion for bridging different groups of people, like end users and developers, and helping them bridge the conversation and have better conversations. But I think one of the things that, as that career grew, one of the things that I found myself in increasing leadership positions and out over my skis a little bit in dealing with the people side of leadership. I felt like I had the tech side down. I felt like I had the process side down, but the people side, it felt like there was a gap there for me. And so about 20 some years ago, I just began a process of it started out by me wanting to learn to be a better leader, and it transitioned into me working with leadership teams and coaching. So
Excellent. Yeah. Well, thank you.
yeah.
Yeah. So today's topic will be really more around than leadership and communication. And, that's one of the things I like to do on the podcast is, we primarily focus on tech sales professionals, but there's more than just selling to build a very successful career over 20, 30, maybe even 40 years. And so I'm excited to have you on today because at the end of the day, leadership, whether you're formally leading, informally leading, and communication, you can't be successful without it. So looking forward to talking about that. So, Marsha, what you talk about leading change. I was doing some research on you, and I was looking. You've got a book. What's the name of your book?
It's called Build Your Model for Leading Change.
Build Your Model for Leading Change. So you talk about leading change, and I do think this is a timely topic as so many companies are adapting and figuring out how to do business differently post-pandemic. Customers have moved all around, and the other thing is, we have this accelerating pace of technology and tools and things like AI that can create threats or opportunities, but regardless, you need to adapt and change. So really, what does leading change mean, when you're out there working with executives?
Yeah. Well, for sure, change is happening all day, every day. I think at the smallest nuanced level, where we might start to change our perspective on something, all the way up to huge, massive changes that are happening across an organization or an industry. I think the essence of change is that it is always happening, and I think sometimes it can seem like we're wanting to make a difference somewhere, or we're wanting something to change. We see an organization that needs to go from point A to point B, and then there's a gap. And so building your model becomes about being really clear for yourself about what is it that you're trying to change? And then how are you going to go about doing that? And how, for some, we might enroll others. For other people, we might do it through putting processes in place. But I think many of us can tell you what we're doing. Very few of us can tell you why we do it. And I think it's about when we're clear about why we do it, it makes differences that we encounter with each other along the way just easier to navigate.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sure you only have to tell them why once, right?
I think, yeah, I think the golden rule in communication is like, I'm certain in sales too. It's about that repetitive message. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, and the reality is we're human beings, right? So there's constantly things going on. There's 14 different priorities of the day, conflicts with any one of those. So
yeah.
yeah, I mean, you've got to continue to communicate that. What are some of the when you think about some of the leaders that you've worked with, or maybe some of the organizations that you've been engaged with, what are some of the mistakes that maybe leaders make when trying to initiate or execute change?
I think, one of the biggest challenges in communication in any aspect is that we make well, I think first off that George Bernard Shaw has this quote that I love, where he says he was a English playwright, and he says the greatest challenge in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. So I think that's where we start, and I think the second part of that is we as leaders, and I think leadership happens at any level, can we make this assumption that everybody sees or experiences the same reality that we do. And so, if you're talking with anybody about any particular problem, whether you're trying to engage them in a sales conversation or you're a leader trying to lead change in the organization, you start out, making a move, setting direction in a conversation. And I think it's really natural human behavior to assume that everybody sees what you see. And I think that's probably one of the greatest mistakes we make from the very start. And then we proceed down that path or that conversation, assuming that everybody else is looking at the same thing that we're looking at, when in fact, it really isn't. We all, see through different lenses. We see through our own behavioral lens. And so it makes it's where conversation starts to break down.
Yes. So if we know that, what are some things that leaders can do to check to see kind of where everybody's at with how they see things versus maybe how you see it as a leader?
Yeah. I think, I talk a lot about the nature of being able to have a structural language, a way to actually look at the structure of our conversations. And I think it's kind of fascinating that our conversations, if we can kind of assign a morally neutral language to be able to look at them, then it helps us be able to see what's happening in the conversation differently. So, for example, if there's a way to look at just simply the direction that's happening in a conversation. So, if a leader makes a move and sets direction in the conversation and says, I want us as an organization to go this direction, then there are actually three other actions that can happen in that conversation. Someone could follow it and get behind the idea and support it. And they say, that might sound like, yep, I'm all in for that. The third action would be someone might oppose, to push back and say, I disagree. I think we're missing something if we go in that direction. And then the fourth action would be to bystand. And that's just a morally neutral comment on what's happening. So a bystand in that conversation might sound like, I notice the industry is changing quite a bit. And a bit of a question, how would this support that? So it's bystand is truly neutral. It's not getting behind something or it's not supporting it. So just as that small, simple example, one of the things that will happen in our conversations is that we'll start to leave out one of those four actions. So effective conversations have all four of those actions voiced. Ineffective conversations will start to leave one of those out. And so I think one of the ways really effective leaders begin to engage is just simply listening for, am I hearing all four of those actions in this conversation? And if I'm not, how can I prompt for it?
Right. So even prompting for somebody that might be fully resistant to pull that out to then adjust and adapt and
Yes. Yeah. Which I think is, so if you think about that as a leader, that can be scary. Like, you've got a big objective or a task, something that you're wanting to encourage. And the idea, like, I think it can be very easy to fall into a trap of just maybe even unconsciously wanting to introduce that. I want to make a move with my group of leaders. And I'm really hoping that everybody is going to get behind me and support me. But I think one of the challenges that emerges is like in those initial conversations, if we're not actually bringing out the opposition there, it seeps out later in really kind of unproductive, unhelpful ways. So, yeah, Chris, you're laughing. So
Yeah.
I'm guessing that maybe that's resonating with you.
Oh, well, I've been through, big organizations, lots of change, and you see the kind of the rank and file, and sales as an example. The We're not at water coolers, but still we find a way to chit chat, and teams will talk negatively about some change because it's been announced, it's been rolled out, and then it's crickets in some cases, and reps will resist it. They'll resist any change for the most part because they don't want to disrupt something that in their mind might be working how they work.
Right.
So I've seen that probably go wrong more than I have seen it go well.
And I think, if you were to just simply focus on what's happening in the dynamics of a conversation that's actually set up the organization for that to happen. So the water cooler talk or the resistance that comes, there will be really valid reasons for why that's happening. And it doesn't mean that everybody gets to have their way. This isn't about like I get to be right or wrong at the end of the day about whether this is the direction we ought to go. But I think one of the mistakes that leaders and leadership teams make is we fail to really fully invite the full dialogue, the full conversation in at the front. And so if we're not creating a place for, let's just, focus on the sales team. Something gets rolled out, sales team has a real specific pushback to it that doesn't get voiced. Instead, it gets that conversation gets had offline, in one-on-one conversations or in instant messaging things where if people are talking about this will never work. I think the task of leaders is to find a way to bring that conversation online, because if I as a salesperson feel like I've got a valid point but I'm not being heard or listened to, the best you're going to get from me is compliance. And at the end of the day, that's not fun, nor is it rewarding. And it just overall, more importantly, I think the organization is missing a voice in that process. So if you go all the way back to some of those initial conversations, for leaders to be able to do what I think is the pretty brave ask of really looking to surface the various viewpoints, even the viewpoints that push back and say, I disagree, and welcome that perspective or that difference into the conversation. I think there's a possibility for a really new idea to emerge. It's not just buy-in. I think buy-in is one aspect of it, but I think a new idea and a new concept, potentially new tweaks to that change get rolled out or get incorporated into the decision.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have worked with one leader in the past that did a really I thought he did a really good job at this because we've gone through changes, and they're always reorganizing the sales organization for some reason, right? And it's always because they want to grow revenue.
Right.
And one of the things that he had always done really well was, he would have the extra calls, he would go have one-on-one calls. And by the way, it was a ton of work for him, but he would go have these conversations. And in some cases, the reps weren't really excited about maybe losing part of their territory, but at least they understood. And I think it created some retention and some stability based on the way he handled that. And eventually those reps kind of come on board and find ways to be successful, and they kind of get over it a little bit. But I've also been in scenarios where the manager or the leaders weren't doing that, and eventually the reps just leave, right? If it's a good, strong market, they just leave. But I love your point about surfacing the various viewpoints. Before we jump into the topic, I wanted to let you know that we just launched a monthly drawing for one of our insulated high-tech Freedom tumblers. Now, I've been sending these out as a thank you gift to each of our guests, and the response has been great. Everyone has a full-size coffee cup, a Yeti, or whatever brand that they might use, but not everybody has the small tumbler that you can put your wine or beverage of choice in. And they're great for the deck, beach, camping, or just keeping your drink warm or cold. Now, I'm not selling these, but I am excited about them. So we decided to offer these up to the loyal podcast listeners by doing a monthly drawing. So if you're interested, go to hightechfreedom.com/mug. That's MUG. And you'll see a picture of the tumbler and you can enter. We'll just collect your name, phone number, and email. And if you do win, we'll then follow up and ask for your mailing address so we know where to send it. If you don't win, your name stays in, so you don't need to re-enter. Now, let me ask you this. In some cases, you talked about communication. Can it be just as simple as incorporating the fact that you acknowledge some of those viewpoints, even if you're not changing the plan in any way?
Yeah, I think sometimes, yes. I often say nobody changes until they feel seen and heard. And I think this isn't to I don't mean ask people. I don't mean disingenuously ask people what they think so that you can get to the task.
Sure.
But yes, I do think sometimes it's just simply, have you paused long enough to hear different viewpoints? So the leader that you're giving the example from, what I would say, likely, potentially unconsciously, but he had a model in which he had defined his process for leading change. There was likely a belief under that of hearing different points of view, of taking the time, even though it was a lot of work. He would have had some connection to say, I do this because I believe that it's important, and I'll go slow to go fast, or I'll hear all voices in order to make sure I've got people's fingerprints on the outcomes. So I do think sometimes it doesn't mean that it's what I say, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to get their way, or that you're going to talk to one person and their idea is going to become the new idea. But I do think that it can shape and shift the thinking of all parties. So not just the leader, to hear the other voices, but I think it's really valuable for all voices to hear one another in some way, because you might have a really different perspective than what I do. You work with different people or different parts of the business than I do. And it shapes and shifts our shared understanding of what our whole business picture looks like. It's complex. Like no one person's going to have the full picture.
It is complex. Well, what about if you're on the receiving end? So let's say you're an individual contributor and there's change being driven. Are there some things that person on the receiving end can be doing to facilitate it, or maybe even take advantage of that change to put themselves in a better situation down the road?
Yeah, I bring everything back to conversation. So, for an individual contributor, I think one of the challenges when change is happening is that we can feel like we're like change is being done to us. And it's our role to just comply or get behind it and support it, and that our voice doesn't matter. I think that's a very common narrative that emerges, and I don't think it's helpful. So where you can, I think as an individual contributor, your task becomes what questions can you ask that are truly genuinely curious questions? Like, how can you engage with leadership in a way that seeks to understand what they're seeing, rather than just be upset about it? How can you invite them into a conversation? I think a lot of senior leaders are in their role, they often feel like they have to have all the answers. If somebody comes to ask them a question, depending on the culture of the organization, they can get very defensive, feeling like they're often having to defend decisions that are made. But I think just the genuine bridging of a question into, can you help me understand? Like, I'm really curious about this change. Can you help me understand what's behind it in a genuinely curious way? I think can help open up that conversation, even from an individual contributor perspective. So it's in the shaping and shifting of our viewpoint, what we're thinking about.
Yeah. And I think, so you touched on it, right? I mean, there's some benefits that you're going to get as an individual contributor. Maybe you better understand something. Maybe you start to feel more comfortable. So that's good and that's healthy.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you're doing that, it's a high probability that 80% of the other team members are not doing it. And, it does raise your stock up a little bit within the eyes of that leader. And so, as they're executing change is hard, right? And they're looking for people to informally help them lead. And, there's opportunities there. If you are interested in progressing in your career, moving up, taking on more responsibility, it's a fantastic way to raise your stock within the company to make that happen.
Yeah. I think it's really about, I'm a big believer in change happens through conversations, and that to have conversation, to have really effective conversations, we need to have relationships with people. And so, Chris, I think what you're pointing to is this idea of curious questions that get directed to leaders can help to build the relationship. It is, and potentially offer up spaces where an individual contributor can also share their perspectives about, "Well, here's what I'm seeing, or here's what life is like on the ground for me." But yeah, it's getting that conversation started.
Love it. Well, so Marsha, if as we get close to wrapping it up here, if somebody was to go check out your book, what do you think would be one or two of the primary takeaways? Why would they want to go read it?
Yeah. Well, I think if you are at any way, shape, or form find yourself having repetitive conversations. So I often say if you work with someone and you find yourself having the same conversation over and over again, one of the ways that can help that is to have a model for how you look at conversation, the structure of conversation. And I think the other part of the book is really about helping you get clear on why you do what you do. And the benefit of that is navigating difference and conflict. I think there is no lack of conflict in our organizations, and being able to navigate difference, how we communicate with one another, I think it either sets us up to have really effective conversations or ineffective ones. So those are two, it's a workbook. So it's definitely not a sit down and read it in one weekend. It's a full color guided workbook. It's designed to sort of sit with you along a leadership development journey.
Yeah, well, those are my favorite kind. Well, I better go pick it up before one of my team members sends me a copy and delivers a message. So, well, Marsha, so we'll have your LinkedIn link in the show notes. Is there another way that somebody could reach out to you if they're interested?
LinkedIn is the best way, and I am pretty good about responding within 24 hours. So just tell me how you found me, and I'm happy to respond.
Excellent. Marsha, anything else that you would like to share?
No, just I think that it's a fabulous purpose that you're up to here. So it's great to be here. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I'm a big believer that we always have to be learning and improving. And as soon as you stop, you're starting to shrink, and that's not a good thing. So I appreciate what you're doing, and thank you for coming on today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks again for joining us today. To get more sales and real estate tips, you can subscribe to our newsletter at hightechfreedom.com. You can also join our private Facebook and LinkedIn group that is exclusively for sales professionals. If you found a nugget of good information in the podcast, please subscribe, give us a positive rating, and write a review. If there is a topic that you would like us to cover in the future, please send us a note through our website at hightechfreedom.com. Until next week, make this your best week ever.